few people of you watching, and you're stuck with a substitute teacher today. Sorry about that. Monique had a family emergency. We had a show planned, but we'll just have to maybe pick up those topics another day. But today I'm going to be continuing our conversations about diversity. I see that Victoria's on the stream. I really hope she'll stick around and ask some awesome questions. And she has some experience in this area, and I would love to have some interaction and with any of you that also have experience with diversity issues. And I've done a few teachings previously. You can go back and just look on the YouTube channel for the Center for Biblical Unity. There's a playlist there on DEI, and I've done some previous teachings on this. But today I thought I would talk about some biblical themes and some biblical alternatives to DEI and just some different questions to ask and offer some biblical thoughts. So it's going to be more like a teaching and a little less like laughing at viral videos today, although that is funny. I kind of, again, this was sort of a last minute decision. Monique had to leave about an hour ago for a family emergency. So you are stuck with the substitute teacher once again. But I do hope that you'll find this helpful, and maybe it'll be something that you can share with others. Let's get started here. And so far, what we've covered in previous conversations about diversity, and again, I would refer you to the YouTube channel for the Center for Biblical Unity. There's a playlist that I've made there related to DEI. So you can, if you want to go back, you can get caught up on those past teachings. But we're just going to kind of start off here with a big picture principle that we've covered in the past. And that is what we don't want to do when it comes to conversations about diversity or diversity, equity, and inclusion is just uncritically adopt a framework that may or may not be based on biblical principles and then try to reorganize our entire work or church culture around it. Like, this is really not a good idea. But you would possibly be surprised with how many schools and churches and Christian institutions that we talk to that have already brought in the language of DEI into their work culture, into their institutional culture. And sometimes what we find is that they haven't really thought this through very deeply. They kind of have heard the culture using these terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I talked about this in the very first teaching in this series, where I talked all about the noble version of DEI and expanding talent pools. And if that's what we're talking about, then okay, we can have that conversation. But that's almost never how it shows up in the real world. And I've been posting DEI stories that people have been sending into the ministry to try to document some of this. And so, in fact, there was a story just yesterday. I don't have that graphic, but we had posted a story related to DEI and its impact in the workplace. And it was a hospital situation. You can go on the Center for Biblical Unity social media to take a look at that story. And it was in a prominent hospital in the Northwest. And it was a nurse who works, I think, in the labor and delivery area of the hospital, talking about the impact of DEI. And then I just saw on social media yesterday that I believe it was one of the co-founders and or the president of the La Leche League, which is kind of a paramedical peer group that helps women with breastfeeding and making that transition after birth. And the leader is just tired of all the trans stuff and the impact of DEI and all of this kind of thing. And so bad ideas have real world consequences. And when Christian institutions start to embed this language into their culture without taking the time to really have clear definitions and goals attached to them, and you would be surprised at how often we talk to Christian institutions and they have the words diversity and inclusion and stuff on their website. But when I ask their leaders, well, what do you mean by this? Most of the time, they cannot define it. And if they do, they just mention Revelation 7, every tribe, nation, and tongue. And for them, that's what we're talking about. And that's not what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. And so, yeah, Kim says the La Leche League was the 90-year-old co-founder. I thought it was the co-founder. Thanks, Kim. And so I think that, this is just such an important topic, because what we don't want to do is just bring that terminology into our Christian institutions and then start using it and normalizing it and not really know what it is that we are talking about. Because when we're talking about diversity and what the world means by diversity, and every other person, who's using this term, more often than not, what they're talking about is hiring and promoting and recruiting women. That's seen it in some cases as a diversity hire. Certain ethnic groups, except white people, except if it's a woman, and various genders, gender fluid people, queer people, and the disabled. And they just kind of put all of these groups together, and they are looking for candidates who fall into what are called historically marginalized groups like this. But my concern is that I see so many Christian institutions just kind of fall in line with this, or they just try to limit it maybe to race issues or women issues or something. And they think that that will be enough to satiate the DEI people, and usually what happens is an institution starts getting concerned about DEI, and particularly Christian institutions, when somebody is hired or comes on the board and starts kind of strongly asking, I won't use the word demanding, but strongly asking for change. This is when Christian institutions start to then say, oh, well, yeah, we should probably do that. And then they start using the terms and beginning to change hiring practices or putting statements on their website, even if not everybody in the leadership team completely knows what's happening or what we're doing. Because, as I've said in a previous teaching, it's like diversity is seen as this universal moral good. And it's going to help us have a better work environment. It's going to do all of, diversity is our strength. And we're given all these very positive messages. And so when someone is hired of influence who comes in and starts talking in these words, and other well-meaning people in the institution are like, yeah, well, we want that. We want to be good people. We don't want to be racist. Yeah, we need more diverse hiring. And so what usually happens is they find some melanated people and they bring them on board. And that's not to say they don't interview them properly or that they're not qualified. But what they don't often do, in our experience, again, and we could have selection bias at work here, but what often happens is that they don't screen people for the ideology, which is something I want to get to later in the teaching here. So, Kim says that the new Department of Defense Secretary is on a podcast. There's a clip going around X yesterday and today. saying that the motto "diversity is our strength" won't work in the military. The armed forces is about strength through unity. Yeah, and that's going to be interesting if he could get confirmed. He seems to be a Christian, so we will see what happens with that because he wants to make some significant changes to the military. So when we're thinking about hiring and recruiting, I think that the things that we ought to be talking about are the organization's goals. This is the first conversation we need to have. And this is the kind of thing that Monique and I try to lead institutions through is, well, first, let's back up. Before we talk about diversity, what are your goals for your church, your ministry, your Christian school? Sometimes the institution can articulate these things, but often they're kind of vague and very, very general. But what we need to have before we talk about diversity is knowing our team's shared goals, knowing what outcomes we want to have for our customers or for our students or for our congregants. Like, what are we trying to do here? Because if we don't know what we're at stake for, then we will not know how to organize the activities and who to hire and all of that. So the first thing we have to do is have some clarity about our goals. And then we have to think about how are we going to perform these goals? How are we going to enhance and the best performance and outcomes? So how are we going to keep people safe? If we're talking about law enforcement or the military, how are we going to create a quality product? How are we going to make that Jesus chicken? How are we going to do this? How are we going to provide an education that prepares students for their lives? Like, all right, what's our goal? And then what are the outcomes that we're wanting? And then how do we get the best performance and create a motivating environment and culture that's attractive to people that they want to come work for us? I've worked in ministry environments before where, you know, it's hard sometimes to attract quality talent when you're not paying the market rate. But if you have a really good work culture, sometimes people will come to you and want to work for you because they're so tired of working in a really bad work culture. Sometimes that's even worth more than some of the pay. But so then after we have clarity about our goals and what we're doing and what kind of work culture we want to create, then we have to think about, all right, who are we going to hire to help us get to these goals? What is that going to look like? Well, we need qualified candidates. We need work experience. We need talent. We need possibly some people with education. And it might not be formal education. We might need plumbers who are qualified and they're not just starting out plumbers. But we might need some apprentice plumbers too. We might need a lot of plumbers. Okay. And that's the education that we need. So I'm not necessarily talking here about strictly school education. Okay. We need people with leadership skills, or at least the potential of leadership skills, that we can grow that person into leadership. We need a variety of personalities and interpersonal skills. We need leaders and trainers or teachers, problem solvers, motivators. But we also need people that can communicate, okay? Good written communication, verbal communication, and they know how to communicate respectfully. But we also need some people who are kind of fairly easy to get along with. We don't want to have a workplace, because we're trying to build a good, healthy workplace culture. So we don't want to have a lot of drama queens. We don't want to have a lot of issues with like people who are kind of verbal bullies. So there's a lot of things that we have to go through in this matrix to try to hire well so that we can produce the best students or produce the best products or that sort of a thing. So these are all things that we need to think about, I think, before we start talking about diversity. And I think that there's just so many important questions to think through. And when we get on calls with people, they're often not clear on these basics. Like they don't really have a vision. And the problem is that they have adopted the DEI lens, the diversity, equity, inclusion lens. But that lens, I think, causes us to center often, not always, but often, the wrong problems and the search for the wrong solutions. I think that we need to start with better questions and identifying what our goals are, what our problems are, what do we need to fix, where is it broken, how does fixing this broken thing fit into our overall company goals, as well as the ethos that we want to build as a work culture. So, and again, these are my opinions, okay? People are free to disagree with them. I'm taking kind of an off the beaten path type of point of view on these things, okay? But in my opinion, I think that the first question we need to ask, or usually prior to the next question, is this candidate going to help us meet our institutional goals? Is this person going to help us even meet our cultural goals of the type of culture we want to build? I don't think that the first question we ought to center is this person a member of a historically marginalized group? I don't think that ought to be our first concern. If I'm hiring a quality pilot, the first thing I want to figure out is, can this person fly planes? How many thousands of hours of experience do they have flying those planes? How have they handled stressful situations when things have gone wrong? I just think that there's other questions that we ought to center before we jump right into the diversity conversation. But what I find over and over again is people are like, oh, yeah, we already know about that. Let's just talk about diversity. And I'm thinking, no, actually, I don't think you know about these things. I don't think that you have really thought through what are the critical goals in our institution and what do we want to build. Yeah, Victoria is bringing up a point that I think is super important. Is she says, if you have a group of people from different states or different family backgrounds, that is diversity. Even if everyone, quote unquote, looks the same. Exactly. I'll never forget a training that we did in the Northwest a few years ago. And almost everybody, I think everybody in the room was white. It was a Christian school. And it was for their teachers, their staff. It was a fairly small Christian school. And yet, even though they were all white and they all looked the same, there was very diverse backgrounds in the room. One gal was a recent immigrant, like a few weeks prior to the training, from Eastern Europe. And she found the whole training completely confusing. She was like, I don't even know what we're talking about here. Other people in the room had grown up very poor or very rich or from a completely different part of the country, or I'm from Appalachia or I'm from Massachusetts. Those might be white people, but those are two very different cultures. So you can have a lot of diversity in the room, even if everybody looks the same. And this is, again, why I think that often DEI conversations are not useful, because it does nothing to identify or interact with certain kinds of diversity. It just flattens out all white people into being practically the same. Let's get into this. So I want to share some principles really quickly here, just some general principles about hiring, just to help get the conversation going. I would welcome your thoughts if you have additional things to share. But the big question I'm asking here is, how could we think more biblically about recruiting? And what I mean by recruiting is not just workplace hiring, although it does include that, but I'm also thinking about board recruiting. I'm thinking about recruiting students for your school. How do we recruit families for our school? Even to some degree, how are we evangelizing our community and what kinds of questions are we asking? Okay. So this is what I'm talking about. I just couldn't include all of that every single time on a slide. So that's what I'm meaning by recruiting, okay? So let's look at the first principle that I have here. And I've called this 5 biblically informed principles for better recruiting. I'm not saying this is an exhaustively complete list. This is a start. And again, I would welcome your feedback on other things. Okay, so these principles, 5 biblically informed principles for better recruiting. The first one is make the application process as impartial as possible. Okay, so this is based on certain scripture passages as a biblical principle about impartiality. And I'm applying that in a particular way to hiring. And I want to give a longer comment here, but here's a couple of scriptures related to impartiality. Leviticus 19:15. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Jesus's words, drawing on this same principle from John 7:24, drawing on the Old Testament, stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. So when we're talking about recruiting and the principle of impartiality in recruiting, I'm not saying that we should show no partiality. We all show partiality when we do background checks, for example. I do a background check when I'm hiring somebody because I want to see if they have fraud in their background. We might have to have another interview. We might have to talk about that. There was a situation where Monique and I were looking to hire somebody, did the background check, and fraud came up. We're like, well, that's very interesting. So sometimes we must discriminate. I'm going to discriminate if I do a background check on a potential babysitter for my kids and they are a felon with a pedophile conviction. Okay, I'm going to protect. Then another law applies in God's law of protecting the innocent and that sort of a thing. So I'm not saying have complete impartiality about everything, about every candidate and treating them the same. But I think that's where Jesus's statement comes in about judging one another fairly and looking at applicants. And so one way that Monique and I have suggested to help foster a hiring environment of impartiality, at least at the beginning of the process of applicants, is using blind application review. So again, we're at the beginning. We're not at the end at the background check phase. We're at the beginning of it, of having blind application review. So there's been several studies, and we could debate, whether or not some people may say some of the studies are more valid than others, but there is some data that I think is somewhat persuasive that people with non-American sounding names or names from certain ethnicities, they don't get calls as much for interviews, and they tend to be selected out simply because of their name and what their name sounds like and their apparent ethnic connection, okay? So when you're reviewing applicants, we have floated the idea of saying, hey, let's do blind applicant review. Let's look at the resumes, let's look at the experience, and call in the candidates that seem the most qualified. Not trying to keep our bias at a minimum and really just looking for, I want the best qualifications, and not letting maybe our heart posture or our personal prejudice jump in front, if that makes sense. Another thing that I think can be helpful is maybe considering unusual candidates, quote unquote, unusual candidates. For example, older candidates tend to have a very hard time getting interviews. They have a very hard time getting jobs. And even somebody my age in their early 50s who still has some good life left in me and I could still use my mind for good things, I would probably have a really hard time getting a conventional job at my age. My husband has applied for many jobs, and it is very rare for him to ever get a call. And so I think that blind applicant review can help us to some degree potentially overcome the anti-age bias or that sort of a thing. Maybe even considering unusual candidates because they're from a cultural context that we aren't familiar with. And so again, I think that the blind applicant review can be helpful. All right, let's get into number 2. My second idea for biblically informed principles for better recruiting is to consider the candidate's gifts and talents. And I think that this is a really important thing. And again, if we're dealing with older candidates, Monique and I have had older candidates apply for jobs when we have put out the notice, and they bring a different skill set. They also bring a different level of maturity oftentimes. They have a longer work history. And Monique and I actually, in some positions that we've looked at, have seen the advantage of looking at older candidates. But that is not the case in a lot of hiring environments. But I think that when we're looking at gifts and talents, this makes me think about scriptures like 1 Corinthians 12 or Ephesians 4, where it's talking in this context about spiritual gifts, that God has given us spiritual gifts, and that there's this idea of diversity of gifts, but unified purpose and the purpose for equipping the body. And I think that there is a general principle here that God has made us all differently. And even if we're not talking about strictly spiritual gifts, he's given us different giftings. I'll tell you, there's some jobs I could never do. I could never be an accountant. I am horrible with numbers. Horrible. Monique laughs at me all the time. I used to, like, at my old job, that was one of the qualities that I looked for when I was interviewing candidates, is they must be good with numbers, because I was so bad with numbers. And so I was looking for somebody that had a strength that I didn't have. God has made us differently. But our tendency, our bias, is that we want to hire people who are just like us. And I think in hiring, we want to find the best quality candidates. And so being open to looking for people with different sets of gifting, different personalities, can sometimes be to our benefit. Now, sometimes it can be hard. Sometimes it's hard to work with people that are so different than us, and we have different work styles. And so that does present its own challenges as well. But I've found in my life, it's also meant some opportunities to grow. All right. Number 3, the third principle for better recruiting is consider when it would actually be useful to hire someone from a different cultural context. Here is where I think the conversation about diversity can come in a meaningful way, not just in a tokenized, let's make sure that we're only hiring women of color this year kind of a way. But let's think about the position. Let's ask some questions about maybe somebody from a different cultural context would be useful here, or maybe somebody from a different generation would be useful here. Now, again, I'm not talking about merely about preferences. Sometimes I think it could actually be useful to have the youth pastor at the church not always be 25. I think there could be some wisdom in hiring an older youth pastor who's lived a little more life, has a little more maturity, and a wife and a couple of kids. I think there could be some wisdom in that, but let's at least step back and ask the question of when could it be useful to hire someone from a different cultural context, a different generation, and that sort of a thing. Looking for somebody who's a little bit different. In answer to the question, does the Bible require us to recruit leaders who are culturally diverse? My answer to that is no. If we look at the qualifications for an elder in a local church, this is what I call a prescriptive instruction from the Apostle Paul. He says, here are the things you need to look for in a quality leader in the local church. There is nothing about make sure that you get somebody who is diverse, that your elder team is very ethnically diverse. You've got a barbarian and a Cretan and a Roman and a Jew. Like there's nothing like that. The qualifications for an elder are largely based in their character. The one skill they need to have is the ability to teach and be able to discern the faith and defend it. But most of these qualities are about a man who is not open to the charge of, whose children are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. He's blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. In other words, he's not a thief or a defrauder. He must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, self-controlled, upright, holy, disciplined. These are all character qualities. So there is nothing prescriptively in Scripture that demands that when we are recruiting a leader in our local church, we must take their ethnicity into account. Okay, that's not in the job description, okay? But there might be times when it could be helpful, okay? For example, if we look at the book of Acts chapter 6, there's a descriptive account of very early in the church's history where the Hellenistic Jewish widows were not, for whatever reason, were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. We don't know why this is happening. As Monique says, they might have been out doing their laundry. We don't know what the situation was. But what the apostles did is they got together and they said, let's focus on the preaching of the word. So they appoint 6 men to be deacons or servants. This is the start of the office of deacon in church history. And what we notice from their names is that they are Hellenized names. In other words, they are not Hebraic names. And so the question here is, in this situation, they recruited cultural insiders. They recruited people to solve this problem who spoke the language, who understood the culture. And in that particular situation, it was useful because they were able to take care of a certain problem that was focused on a particular group. And in that way, then cultural considerations seemed important. And I think that there are some times that if we are trying to reach a particular demographic with the gospel, we might need some cultural insiders. If, for example, you're at a church and you're in ministry leadership and you're wanting to evangelize your community, but you're let's say you're an elder, you're on the elder team in a predominantly Chinese speaking church, okay? But over time, the neighborhood has changed and now it's a predominantly Spanish speaking community that you find yourselves in. Well, maybe that elder team might want to get together and say, hey, brothers, we noticed that times have changed. Our neighborhood has changed. We should probably get a Spanish speaking cultural insider on our staff and plant a church here and support him in ministry and someone with the gift of evangelism to begin to evangelize our community and creating a new church here. Well, that's when cultural considerations are actually intentional and useful and helpful. And so I think that um I'm not saying at no time can we think about cultural issues and culturally based hiring. I think sometimes we might need that. If you're a church and you are in San Francisco and you say, we have a big population in San Francisco in our neighborhood around our church that are members of the LGBT community. Maybe we should hire a cultural insider with the gift of evangelism to help us figure out how to do better outreach to this community. That seems like a perfectly legitimate reason to engage in, quote unquote, a diversity hire. It's not because we're just hiring for the sake of diversity and getting somebody in here. We're saying, hey, we see an oversight and we want to correct it because our good or service is not reaching a particular community. So the cultural considerations. What if we are trying to reach a particular demographic with our good or service? What if a particular demographic is being overlooked in our marketing? What if just translating our marketing into a different language could help spread our message even more? Well, we should probably hire a cultural insider to help us do that. What if particular questions aren't being asked that would help us do better research or provide better services? I've studied a lot of this as part of my doctoral dissertation. Prior to women coming into scientific research in larger scale in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of women's health issues that weren't being studied by scientists. There wasn't a lot known about particular women's health issues. Well, that's because there weren't women who were working in science. And once women started coming in, they started asking different questions. Well, that's not progressive. That's not liberal. That's just helping to expand and improve the research so that there could be better medical care for a group of people that might be missed. So what we don't want to do is just so villainize the conversation about diversity that we say there's no place to have, any conversation about cultural differences or differences between men and women. Sometimes those things do matter. So how could we think about some interview questions, like to really make it practical? If you're in an interview situation with somebody and you're trying to hire for a position that does require special attention or a cultural issue, you could ask something like, tell me about a time when you worked with people from a different culture and you had to work through a conflict. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it was resolved or not resolved. That's a good interview question. You could ask, tell me about a time when you worked with someone from a different generation and you had to work on a project together. These are the kinds of practical things that we need to be thinking about as we're hiring paint the picture for me. And I think that this will help us kind of move past some of our fears about, well, if I'm hiring for a cultural position, then, I'm falling into the DEI vortex. Well, not necessarily, okay? All right, number 4, look for righteous behavior is my 4th principle for better recruiting. When you're in an interview process, no matter even if you're hiring in a secular place, you want to think about the person's character. You want to think about what kind of character does this person have? And just as a couple of very, very quick examples of what this might look like is, for example, the Bible talks about not giving false testimony against your neighbor, not stealing. Like when we're hiring, we want to hire honest people. We want to hire ethical people. We don't want to hire people who have, and again, here's where we are engaging in a form of partiality that is for protection. We want to hire people who have good behavior. I think another list, even though we're not necessarily hiring an elder in our business, this is a good list that Paul gives us in Titus 1 of someone who is not given to drunkenness and not violent and not a thief. They're either a good person, a nice person, hospitable. They love what is good. They are self-controlled. They have self-discipline. I mean, those are some general characteristics that I want to detect in my employees when I'm interviewing them. So here's the kinds of questions that I frequently ask in interviews is, tell me about a time when you had to work through a problem or a conflict with a coworker related to different work styles. You find out a lot about people's character when they answer this question. You know, they might tell you a really long and wicked story about their former supervisor. And then you start detecting, oh, this person likes conflict. This person's really into conflict. I probably don't want this person working with us. This might harm our work environment. Another question I ask a lot is, tell me about a time when you had to forgive a coworker. Tell me about what happened and how it got resolved. This is a very telling question, and you can tell a lot if you're doing hiring in how people answer this question. If sometimes people have, they can't recall any time that they've ever had to forgive a coworker. That's interesting to me. It's also interesting when they really like go overboard and painting themselves as a victim. And then you can tell a lot about their emotional intelligence when they share a story and you're like, wow, that was a really tough situation. And I think you handled it really, really well. If they didn't handle it well, and then they say, I didn't do so good, but here's what I learned from it, that's awesome. But that question tells me a lot about the person's behavior in the workplace and their personal character. And those are the kind of people that I want to look for as an employer. Okay, finally, my fifth principle is looking for worldview alignment. This is, in my humble opinion, the area where most Christian institutions go wrong. And here's why I say that. Because even though most Christian institutions that we work with will tell us a part of their interview process is asking for the person's personal testimony. That's great. But that's a baseline. That's just the bare minimum of what I want coming into my work environment if I'm hiring at a church or a ministry or a Christian school. I have to figure out, what are my interview questions going to be that is going to help surface the deeper views of this person's worldview? And do they have an integrated worldview? Have they thought through some things of cultural issues and how that connects to the Christian worldview? So here's a couple of interview questions that I might ask is, what is your understanding of what it means to be a Christian? Okay, so maybe they've just shared their Christian testimony, but then ask them a follow-up question. What is your understanding of what it means to be a Christian? How would someone know whether or not they are a real Christian? This is highly revelatory. You will find out, a lot about their personal theology and how they think and what being a Christian really means to them. Sometimes our students, here's another question. Sometimes our students, in a scenario of a Christian school right now, don't know who Jesus is. Can you give us a 5-minute presentation of the gospel? And just asking them to do it right then, right on the spot. See what happens. Can they share the gospel? This would be very revelatory in detecting what their, not just their testimony, not just telling a story about themselves, but what do they see as being the objective facts of the gospel? Okay, let's do a couple more questions on this worldview issue. Here's a couple more. Tell us about a time when you felt like there was an injustice happening in your workplace. What was the situation? Did you do anything about it? This is a great question, especially if you're hiring like a manager or a leader, to see, you will see revealed, it'll uncover, how are they defining justice? What do they consider an injustice? This could reveal whether or not they have sympathies towards social justice, or if they know about the concept of biblical justice. Another question could be, tell us what you would do if a student disclosed to you that he or she was experiencing same-sex attraction. Again, a very important question, going beyond just share your personal testimony. Okay, they're a Christian, check. All right, let's look at your references and your experience. Check, check. Okay, you're hired. What we are trying to do is figure out worldview alignment. This is absolutely critical, and in my opinion, this is the most often overlooked step by Christian institutions in their hiring. I want to go back to Kim's question. What about from the employee perspective? What could they look for to ensure the work environment won't be bogged down in DEI nonsense? That's a really great question. I don't know if I've really thought that through, because you do want to have your questions. Like, one question you can ask in an interview is, can you tell me about the work culture? Can you tell me about any major structural changes that have happened at the company in the last 3 years, 4 years, kind of since 2020? You could, I don't know if there's a recruiter on the stream. If there are any recruiters who watch this, email me. I would love to know. Like, I don't know if it would be really awful to just straight out ask, like, what is your work culture like when it comes to DEI issues? How many trainings do I have to go to each year? What's required? You could just ask straight out of like what kinds of trainings. Now, by state law, you have to go to harassment training, at least in California, like once every 2 years, your employer has to provide that. But some trainings are optional, so you could ask, are they required? Are they optional? You could just ask. But I would ask an open-ended question in the beginning of, describe your work culture. Have you made any major structural changes in the last 4 years? I don't know. Those are thoughts off the top of my head, but if there's any recruiters on here, you can jump in. Natalie said, I worked at a Christian school once, and I was interviewed by a pastor. He asked me what I was reading in the Bible at the time and how I was serving my church. Yeah, those are good questions. Because some people might be hard-pressed to answer those questions. And I'm going to tell you, like, when Monique and I interview people for jobs, it's often 90 minutes. Usually an hour for a volunteer position and more like 90 minutes for a paid position. And then we usually have a second or sometimes even a third interview. And sometimes we have people do projects. Like, we really try to vet people. So Natalie says, my questions could get people not hired, but maybe that's for the best. That's what I'm saying, is like, asking will, if it's a very DEI promoting environment, yeah, I don't know. Maybe they'd want to share. Maybe they'd be excited you asked if you can kind of conceal your motivation a little bit. I don't know. Okay, friends, that's the teaching. I hope you found it helpful and that you will um, share it with someone relevant in your life, someone who does hiring, your pastor, your Christian school administrator, and, just helping people get a little further down the road in their thinking on these issues. And once again, I encourage you, if you want to find out more about the previous conversations that I've had on diversity, just go to the Center for Biblical Unity YouTube channel and click right on that playlist on DEI, and it's the first teachings that are right at the top. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your interaction. I appreciate it. And Kim has another good tip here is check the company's website for DEI statements. Yeah, if they've got something that they're advertising right on the front of the website, like you know exactly where they stand. And as Monique and I say, I always appreciate clarity. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this teaching helpful, and send me your feedback, send me your ideas. Tell me what I screwed up. That's fine. You can email me at info@Center for Biblical Unity.